I know you're wondering how I got myself in this situation. Well, here's my story. End of a desolate road set an ancient house cloaked in ivy and darkness. Inside lived a woman named Agnes, whose fear of death consumed her. Decades ago, she had watched loved ones vanish into the grave, one after the other, convinced that death would come for her next. She fortified her home into an impenetrable prison. Every window was sealed with planks. Every door was bolted shut with deadlocks and chains. The phone said silent, its cord severed. Agnes had no visitors, no friends, and no family, only her fear to keep her company. She spent her days knitting by candlelight, her ears straining for the faintest sound. Death would not catch her unaware. Death is clever. One moonless night as the wind howled outside, Agnes sat in her armchair, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the ticking of the grandfather clock. The fire in the fireplace cast along flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own accord. She sipped her tea, her nerves raw from years of solitude. Then she heard it, a faint scratching at the door. Her heart froze. She gripped her knitting needles so tightly her knuckles turned white. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. She tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing but darkness greeted her. "Go away!" she croaked, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. Agnes stood frozen for a long moment, listening to the wind howl. Finally, she convinced herself it was a branch or perhaps a stray animal. She shuffled back to her chair, muttering about her frayed nerves, but just as she sat down, she heard it again. This time, the scratching came from the kitchen. Agnes crept towards the kitchen, clutching a fireplace poker for protection. The sound was louder now, a frantic scudding that made her skin crawl. When she reached the kitchen, she saw it, a small mouse darting across the floor, its tiny claws scratching against the wood. She let out a shaky laugh. "Just a mouse," she whispered. Relief washed over her as she lowered the poker. But then the mouse stopped. It stood on its hind legs and looked directly at her. Its eyes were black pits, bottomless and shining with malice. A strange sound escaped its mouth, a low guttural laugh that didn't belong to any rodent. Agnes stumbled back, her breath hitching. The mouse scurried closer, its movements unnaturally jerky, as if something much larger and darker controlled it. She grabbed the broom and swung at it, but the mouse was too quick. It darted into the shadows, its laughter echoing in the empty room. Night, Agnes locked herself in her bedroom, the door secured with every latch and chain she could muster. She lay in bed, the blankets pulled up to her chin, but sleep would not come. Her house, once her sanctuary, now felt alive with unseen eyes. The scratching began again, soft at first, then louder. It came from within the walls. Agnes pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it grew louder and louder until it was deafening. Then a whisper joined the scratching, slithering through the air like smoke. "Agnes." She bolted upright, her eyes darted around the room. The whispers came again, closer this time. "Agnes, you can't hide." A shadow shifted in the corner of her room. Her candle flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for a match, but before she could light it, she felt it, a tiny cold paw scuffering across her foot. She screamed and jumped out of bed, her heart hammering. The mouse was there, sitting in the middle of the floor, but it wasn't alone. His form rippled and stretched, his body elongating into something tall and skeletal. What had once been a mouse was now a hooded figure, his face hidden beneath the veil of shadows. It held out a bony hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. "I told you, Agnes," the figure rasped. "You can't hide from me." Agnes ran. She flung upon the bedroom door and stumbled into the hallway, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to shift around her, its walls narrowing, its shadows deepening. She heard the creature behind her, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing in the dark. She reached the front door and clawed at the locks, her fingers trembling, but no matter how hard she tried, the chains wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and she felt his presence behind her. "You lived a long time, Agnes," the voice hissed. "It's time. It's time." She turned, pressing her back against the door. The figure loomed over her face, his face still obscured. His hands reached out and she screamed, swinging the broom wildly, but the figure was no longer there. Instead, the mouse was back, sitting at her feet, staring up at her with those black, soulless eyes. It grinned, its tiny teeth glistening in the dim light. Agnes stumbled backwards, and suddenly, the ground was gone. She awoke in a place that wasn't her home. It was vast, empty, void, cold and silent. The mouse was there, perched on her chest, his voice echoing in her ears. "You try so hard, Agnes, but no one escapes me." As the mouse scurried away, Agnes realized the truth. Her fortress had been nothing but a cage, and death had been inside all